While we tend to think of the Renaissance as a time of visual art, painting, and sculpture, literature is also very important. Remember, this is a time of ideas. So the writers of the Renaissance kind of explore and explain some of those key Renaissance ideas we talk about. One of the earliest and most important Renaissance writers was Francesco Petrarch. Petrarch is often called the father of humanism, and he's so called because he rediscovered and popularized a lot of the ancient Roman writers. In one of the great libraries of Florence, he found some lost letters of Cicero, the ancient Roman writer. And Petrarch wrote biographies about these classical Roman writers and popularized the idea that the ancient past, Greece and Rome, was really the glory of history. In fact, the idea that the Middle Ages was a dark age comes from Petrarch. He's the first to apply that term to the Middle Ages, which a lot of historians will later dispute, but that's sort of where that came from. In that same vein, you have Leonardo Bruni. Bruni was another early writer, and he was really considered a historian. He wrote biographies of ancient Greek and Roman writers, as well as modern-day artists. And you can see in this quote here from one of his works, he emphasized learning in Latin, the classical grammar and rhetoric of ancient Rome, which is one of those key Renaissance ideas of humanism. Another writer was Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron. You might remember in our medieval unit we talked about Geoffrey Chaucer. How Chaucer wrote this book, the Canterbury Tales. He actually got the idea from Boccaccio. Boccaccio wrote this book called the Decameron, and the setting is that you've got this group of friends and nobles see that the plague is coming to their cities. They all sort of board themselves up in their villa to wait out the plague. And while they're waiting there, they pass the time by telling stories. So it really ends up being a book of stories set during this plague time. But one thing is important to know about Boccaccio. We count Geoffrey Chaucer as a late medieval writer in England, but he's living at the same time as Boccaccio, who's a Renaissance writer in Italy. So you can see how the Renaissance starts in Italy and spreads from there. Boccaccio is also important because while a lot of people were writing in Latin, he's also writing in the vernacular. He's writing in the Italian dialect of Florence at the time. So he's also writing things in his own language. He was also important in that he wrote a book of biographies about women, some mythological and some modern and some historical. And it was really one of the first works in Western history that was dedicated just to the lives of important women. One of the more infamous writers of the Renaissance is Niccol Machiavelli. Machiavelli is a kind of interesting character. He worked for the Medici family in Florence until he kind of picked the wrong side in a political conflict, and eventually he was banished from the city. And at the time, he was a political writer as well as a humanist. Once he gets expelled from the city, he writes this book called The Prince, and it's not terribly long, but what it is sort of a guidebook for rulers. It tells them things they should and shouldn't do. And while you might think, in the Middle Ages, the ideas of chivalry and religion being very important, a lot of writers might say you need to be honest and fair, but Machiavelli is very straightforward. He tells rulers that they need to pretty much lie, cheat, and steal and get away with whatever they can to keep themselves in power. One of the more famous quotes from The Prince is this idea of whether it is better for a ruler to be feared or to be loved. And Machiavelli's argument is that the best thing to do would be both, but if you have to pick one, it should be to be feared. And this kind of became a basis for a lot of later dictators. For example, we go to the 1930s in Italy. The fascist dictator Benito Mussolini used The Prince as sort of a model for how he should rule. And some later historians and literature critics wonder if Machiavelli was actually really honest here, or was sort of a satire, since he's sort of criticizing the ruler who kicked him out of his hometown. But nevertheless, The Prince becomes a very important work of political literature in the Renaissance. Just like we didn't have a lot of important female writers who were well respected in Italy, you don't have a lot of popular women writers. Did I just say writers twice? Probably. In any case, there are a handful of really significant ones that were well known in the time. One of those is Vittoria Colonna. Colonna was a noblewoman, and she lived in the 16th century, sort of the later part of the Renaissance. But she was known for her poems, her books of sonnets, like this one here that she wrote to her husband while he was off fighting a war in other parts of Italy. But also she was a patron of the arts. She helped get some books published. And she was well known in the artistic circles. She was a close confidant of Michelangelo. He was about 10 years younger than she was, but they were close friends, and he dedicated a lot of his works to her. And one of the books she helped publish was Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. A courtier is somebody who works in a noble court. He hangs out with the nobility and the lords and those kind of things. And Castiglione wrote this book called The Book of the Courtier as sort of a guidebook for not rulers, but the people who hung around them. And it gives us an idea of what expectations were for Renaissance people. And this is where we get the idea of the universal or Renaissance man. Castiglione explains that somebody who's a good courtier ought to be good at speaking, at dancing, at fencing, at playing music, at singing. He should be able to read Latin and Greek and Italian and French and German. He should be a painter as well as a songwriter. So basically this argument that they should be good at everything really comes from Castiglione, or at least is well explained by him. And so, too, he also argues that women ought to not necessarily be at the forefront, that mostly they should be sort of more passive. So again, the Renaissance kept some of those more traditional roles, and in that sense, maybe it was not as revolutionary as we think. But Castiglione still stands as one of those important Renaissance writers we should know.